Judges chapter 9. And this is going to be one of those times, I don't think I've ever had it quite like this. I'm going to start at verse 30, and I'll be going to the end of the chapter. And not because, this is one of those times where I was looking through, and it's just like because there are times where a single word can give you like half your lesson. And this is one of those times where it's just like, had to deal with blocks of verses. So we'll not pre-read everything here because we actually want to get out before church morning service. So we'll start at verse 30. And when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaul, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled. So let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you again for this day, Lord. We thank you for your word, that you've given it to us, Lord, that we may learn and grow. Pray that you just be with me as I speak, Lord, and I'd say what you want. Amen. The title is Jotham's Curse. Jotham was Gideon's youngest son. He's the only son, other than Abimelech, that survived Abimelech's coup, that he went through and killed all his other brothers. So at this point, a man named Gaul decided to rise up against Abimelech because he set himself up as king, and Zebul was still like the deputy that was appointed by Abimelech, so some loyalty to Abimelech. So he reported to Abimelech, hey, you got somebody that's trying to do an insurrection against you. But verse 30, and it said, and Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaul, the son of Ebed. His anger was kindled. And what I got from this was that words hurt. Gaul had just insulted Zebul back up in verse 28. He's saying, who is this Abimelech? Who is Zebul, his officer? These are nobodies. And he insulted Abimelech, the man who gave Zebul his position. And he said he was angry. His words hurt. I don't know if so much if they say it now, but like when I was in grade school, the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Not quite true. Words can hurt, and not all do. I just had, what was it, this last week? I don't know whether I accidentally cut the guy off because I didn't see anybody. But I looked in my rearview mirror, and somebody was very unhappy with me. Do you know how much time I actually spent thinking about what he was unhappy? Not much. But some people can hurl insults at you, and 5 minutes later, you don't even remember who they are. But now, take the reverse. If you have a close friend make an accusation against you and mock and insult your wife and children, that can hurt. So, it talks, in Proverbs, it's the section that I read is talking about somebody that's unfaithful to their spouse. But it's Proverbs 6:27 says, can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? In general, that's talking about being an unfaithful spouse, but it's also the general understanding that, hey, fire burns and it hurts. I believe Craig will be in here a little bit, this morning. He burned his leg on motorcycle muffler. And I guarantee you he's in a lot of pain because, burns hurt. And James 3:6 says, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So the tongue among our members, that it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire of hell. Our tongue is described as a fire. Several years ago, my neighbor, he has an outdoor wood burner. He emptied his ashes, and it was this time, there's no snow, all the grass is winter killed, and a little spark come floating out of his little ash pit. And next thing you know, his backfield is on blaze, my backfield's on fire. How much does it take to start all that fire burning? The fires that happened out in California a year or two ago that burned hundreds of acres and houses and everything. It didn't take somebody going out there with a big old huge tank of gas spraying around and pulling a flamethrower and lighting everything off. It probably just took like, a single match. A single little spark is all it would have taken to cause immense devastation. That's the same thing with our words. A single careless or thoughtless word can ruin a lifelong relationship. And don't tell me don't say me. I just think it, but I don't say it. What is in the heart will eventually slip out. I had, my best friend in high school learned this lesson really hard. He had a derogatory name for one of the teachers, and he told me the name all the time, and I told him, look, don't do this. And he said, it's no problem. I do it. And then as soon as he got from there, he got up and went to talk to the teacher, and he called him that name to his face. So if you think it, eventually it will come out. So be careful with your words, because they can hurt. The next set of verses, 31 to 33. And he sent messengers unto Abimelech, this is Zebul, privily, saying, Behold, Gaul the son of Ebed and his brethren be come to Shechem, and behold, they fortify the city against thee. Now therefore come up by night, thou and the people that is with thee, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall be that in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, thou shalt rise early and set upon the city, and behold, when he and the people that is with him come out against thee, then thou mayest do to them as thou shalt find occasion. This is showing like all the relationships between, there's Abimelech, there's Zebul, and there's Gaul. None of these guys all had good relationships with each other, man. They were at each other's throats. The world may unite to persecute the child of God, but do not mistake that for a unity in the world. The things of God give the world a common enemy, so they unite against that, but the world doesn't get along very well with itself. I mean, you look at you look at our political parties, and everybody that kind of votes with their party, these groups don't get along very well. The world just does not get along with themselves very well, but they only, but they unite against the common enemy, against the family of God, against the children of God. But when they no longer have that common foe, they just, cats and dogs amongst themselves, fighting and bickering, scheming, backstabbing. That leads to the next point is, Zebul saying, hey, this is, Abimelech, this is the plot, this is the scheme, this is the plan that we need to do to deal with what we need to do to deal with Gaul. You notice how often the world schemes and plots. Psalms 64:6, it's talking about the wicked. It says, they search out iniquities, they accomplish a diligent search. Both the inward thought of every one of them and the heart is deep. This is a description of how, it says the deep. They think and they plot and they plan. And they figure, okay, we're going to do this to lead to this, to cause this to happen. They devise intricate plans to accomplish some goal. Our politicians do this often. They say the smoke-filled back room where they devise plans and plots. That happens all the time. You can see the whole narrative, especially once it's done or it's moving, or depending on how much experience you've got in it. You can see how all the pieces are moved, and because it's kind of like how I don't think I've got it in my lesson here, but maybe I do. Got to be careful here. There are too many things that happen in the same time that it can't be a coincidence. I'll leave it at that, because I do remember that is another point later on. But the thing is, we shouldn't be surprised that the world plots and schemes. They'll plot and scheme against themselves, against others, against the children of God, children of God. Because 2 Timothy 3:13 says, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. This is the natural state. This is what they do. My sister, I don't think it's not this dog, it was a previous dog. The dog would, before he laid down, would circle about 5 or 6 times. And no matter what you did, always 5 or 6 times before he laid down. It was the same spot. Just circle that. That was his nature. And there was no amount of, of beating or discipline or treat or trick, whatever. You weren't going to go against his nature to stop doing that. The plotting and the planning, the scheming of the world, that is their nature. They're not going to stop that. That is what they do naturally. Verses 34 to 37. It says, and Abimelech rose, and the people that were with him by night, and they laid wait against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gaal the son of Ebed went out and stood in the entering of the gate of the city. And Abimelech rose, and the people that were with him from lying in wait. And when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, behold, there come people down from the top of the mountains. And Zebul said unto him, thou seest the shadow of the mountains, as if it were men. And Gaal spake again and said, see, there come people down by the middle of the land, and another company come along by the plain of Menonim. I labeled this as obvious lies. Gaal was at the city gates, and he saw Abimelech's army coming down, and he said, hey, look, that's people. And Zebul says, yeah, you're just seeing things. It's not, it's nobody. Anybody remember the name Baghdad Bob? Everybody's giving me this is the Iraqi Minister of Information when Desert Storm happened. This was the one that was every single night is Iraq is winning. We are winning. We are massacring the American troops. Even as the American tanks are rolling into Baghdad itself. He's like, we are winning. We are on the verge of victory. The American troops are committing suicides. They want to be captured. We are moments away from victory. Obvious lies. There is a series on HBO about the Chernobyl incident, but in there, one of the lines they say is, when the truth offends, we lie and lie until we can no longer remember it is even there. But it is still there. Every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, that debt is paid. The thing is, a lie, no matter how big or little, can never change the truth. The truth is, the truth always remains. And some, in this case, like Gaal, he believed the lie for a little bit. Some believe a lie. They believe the lie of the world because they don't want to accept the truth. Because if they accept the truth, then it means they have to do something about it. A lost person accepting the truth of their condition, now they have to make a choice. It's like before you could claim ignorance, but now it's like, oh, now I know. And now it's there's a difference between with God. It's not not that a person that is ignorant of his commands, stuff like that, is going to get away, but God gives a little more mercy to somebody that is ignorant on something. But when you know what is right and wrong, and you choose to do wrong, you've chosen to willfully walk. You get a lot less grace and mercy when you willfully walk against God's commands. Verse 38. Then Zebul said unto him, where is now thy mouth, wherewith thou sayest, who is Abimelech, that we should serve him? Is not this the people that thou hast despised? Go out, I pray now, and fight with them. Label this verse as comeuppance. You had to know Zebul felt good here, because here is Gaal, trash talking Abimelech and Zebul himself, and then now when Abimelech shows up, it's like, okay, Gaal, put your money where your mouth is. Many of us like to see the proud being humbled, but they, both sides actually rarely learn from a proud person's downfall. We see somebody, get in trouble, and we're like, yes, finally they got it. But, if given the chance, a lot of people would do exactly the same thing as the proud person would do, except, whatever caused their downfall won't happen to them. Because as Pastor Walters used to say, everybody thinks they're the exception. It won't happen to me because I'm the exception. And also, if you be very careful, if we see somebody that stumbles, even if it's somebody that is, of the world and they rightly deserve what they get. Proverbs 24:17, rejoice not when thy enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbleth, lest the Lord see it and to displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him. The Lord doesn't take kindly to, when people are happy and rejoice that somebody has fallen. The next section of verses, 39 to 41. And Gaul went out before the men of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many were overthrown and wounded, even unto the entry of the gate. And Abimelech dwelt in Arum, and Zebul thrust out Gaul and his brethren, that they should not dwell in Shechem. Gaul was defeated. And after Gaul was defeated, Zebul kicked him and his brethren, his family, out of Shechem. And the thing is, defeat happens to everybody in everybody's life. It all happens to everybody. One of the sayings is, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. How do we react when a coworker or a relative, enemy, a brother, sister in the Lord, they crash and burn in life? Do we take the opportunity to give them an extra kick while they're down? Again, Pastor Walters said, for those internet, stuff like that, he's my former pastor when I was a teenager. So that was like 35 plus years ago.
It was yesterday.
Yeah, just yesterday. But he said the Christian army is the only army that shoots its own wounded. When a brother or sister in the Lord falls, a lot of people will ostracize them. They'll give their own kicks kick them while they're down. And read First and Second Corinthians, where it talks about the man that rightly needed to be judged. And then Paul said, okay, fine, he's judged, he's repented. Now, bring him back in before lest he fall away and be gone. But when you have somebody in your life that has been defeated, had a defeat, what will they remember more? Well, actually, let me rephrase that. When somebody, if I can say this right, get back in the train of thought. What will somebody remember more? When you were one of the many that were with them while they celebrated success? Or will they remember that you were one of the few that consoled them as they sat in their ashes of defeat? How many, this is going to be another one of those things where you date people, but how many remember the worldwide of sports were like that? The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. You watch that, every Saturday, watch that skier come down off that jump and wipe out and spin out. Everybody was happy and glad to know that person that got the thrill of victory. But I wonder, the agony defeat guy, how many people you think he had come up and, commiserate with him, console him? Because, that had to hurt. It's the same thing. This, we mention often about Job and his friends. Job and the trials, everything that he went through. He sat there and he literally sat in the ashes of the defeat. And his friends came and it said for the first week, his friends were the best friends they could ever be. You just sat there and just were with him while he mourned. And then they just say, they decided that we can't keep our mouths shut anymore. My neighbor had a shirt. It was a big old bass going after a hook, and the T-shirt said, "Sometimes it pays to shut your mouth." So, on to verse 42. It came to pass on the morrow, this is after Gaul has been defeated, that the people went out into the field, and they told Abimelech. And he took the people and divided them into 3 companies and laid wait in the field and looked, and behold, the people were come forth out of the city, and he rose up against them and smote them. And Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood in the entering of the gate of the city, and the 2 other companies ran upon all the people that were in the fields and slew them. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day and took the city and slew the people that was therein and beat down the city and sowed it with salt. This just come to mind. But chapter 9 in Judges is where things really kind of like have gone over the top and things start going downhill pretty fast. After this, there isn't too many more, we would say, really good judges. It seems like everything after this just gets darker and worse in the book of Judges. And, Abimelech doing what he's doing here it's just, things just get worse because Israel didn't want to obey. But anyway, the subject for these a couple verses is I labeled as revenge. Because Abimelech wasn't done with Shechem, even though Shechem thought they were done with Abimelech. He said, okay, you've gotten the guy you want, Abimelech, so everything should be good. But these people had betrayed him. They had wanted to capture him from earlier in the verses, that they were waiting in the mountains to capture Abimelech. He was going to avenge himself of them and make them an example. The thing is, revenge is a nasty path to go down. People feel justified in doing it because they feel that they have been wronged and it is their responsibility to make it right. And the problem is with our flesh and our worldly nature, we just don't want things to be equal. We want payback and we want interest as well. And you look at the emotions of revenge, there's a lot of anger, hatred, bitterness, pride. Those come to mind when somebody wants revenge. And what does the Bible say about, anger and hatred and bitterness and pride? When we try to avenge ourselves also, it rarely solves anything and usually makes things worse. If you want to, one of my common themes that I use is you get two people that are road raging, in our term for the day, road raging out on the freeway. They each feel that they're fully justified in what they're doing as they're trying to outperform or get their revenge on somebody else, and that person's trying to do the same thing. And sooner or later, they don't actually solve anything by what they're doing. They just end up making it worse. People that weren't even involved in their little revenge fight going on end up getting hurt. Next, going on to verse 46. When all the men of the tower of Shechem heard that, they entered into the hold of the house of the god of Berith. And Berith, this is the temple of Baal Berith, who was in Shechem. This was actually when Abimelech was setting up trying to set up his initial kingdom and get everybody behind him. He was actually given money from the temple of Baal Berith. So now the people that gave him money, everybody is, they're trying to use that temple as their deliverer or their place of safety. So I labeled verse 46 as, who is your deliverer? The Bible doesn't say it, but I imagine at least some of those people in the hold were praying to Baal Berith and asking for deliverance. All Baals, please save us. But, as God routinely pointed out and mocked, all these idols, had ears, but they can't hear. They have a mouth, they can't speak. They have hands, but they can't do anything. The one I like the most in Isaiah talks about a guy that goes out with his axe to a forest, cuts down a tree, and he takes one particular good piece of wood, and he makes an idol out of it, and the rest of the wood he chops up to burn for fire to cook his dinner. So, it was his choice, So he said part of it goes to cook your food and to warm you, and the part of it goes to make your idol. Like, you're not really seeing here what you're doing, are you? Let's see. Oh, how many of us in here have heard of somebody having a temple of Baal Berith in their house or neighbor or something like that? Anybody here? Anybody know of the nearby temple of Baal Berith? Anybody? So that particular idol. Yeah, that particular. Yeah. Let's not get the church really in trouble. For those on the internet, Pastor made a comment that I will not repeat. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine, but the thing is, we don't have temples of Baal Bereth to be, for people to go to for their deliverer nowadays. But we have our own version of our own deliverers today. When we're in serious trouble and trials, what do we turn to? Do we whip out the almighty credit card? This will solve my problem. Or do we look at our bank account and, I've got enough money in my bank account to handle this problem? Or do we look to friends and family? Hey, call up friends and family. Hey, I got a problem. Can you help me out? The thing with the friends and family, though, is a lot of times it seems that there's always one particular family member or one particular friend that everybody goes to. But when they need help, when that particular friend or family member needs help, everybody's like, what does the saying goes? People are usually available in the past tense when it comes to needing help. Sometimes, some people for their deliverer is their own intellect and physical strength. I've seen some pictures of, professional bodybuilders when they were back in their heyday. I mean, they were physically, incredible. And I look at it now, man, and they're just, like you can't ever talk to the same person. Their physical strength has failed them. Face it, as we get older, the mind sometimes slows down. Your intellect can fail you. Some people, their possessions are their deliverer. Or actually, sometimes it's a question whether or not who owns the possession, you or the possession. Do you own the possession or does the possession own you? But, some of these things, they can deliver you from some trials, but eventually all these things will fail. Your credit card limit's going to run out. Then still got to pay it back. Your bank account can run out. Your friends and family can say, hey, I'm just not available. Your intellect can fail you. Sometimes the problem, you just can't outthink it. Sometimes the problem's too hard. You can't, outmuscle it. Possessions can break or be stolen, gone. Eventually all those things are just going to fail. We need to be in the habit of turning to God first every time. Yeah. I'm slowly getting to the point, like when you drop that nut or that bolt, and you're like, God, I need to find that nut or bolt. Now it's getting to the point where that's the first thing I do, as opposed to, it's like, oh man, pull out the broom, pull out the flashlight, and hunt around for about 15 minutes and find, it's like, you know what? Maybe I should just pray and ask God, and then you find it. That's happened often enough that it can't be a coincidence. Next one, verses 47 to 49. And it was told Abimelech that all the men of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. And Abimelech gat him up to Mount Zalmon, and all the people that were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bow from the trees, and took it and laid it on his shoulders, and said unto the people that were with him, what ye have seen me do, make haste and do as I have done. And all the people likewise cut down every man his bow, and followed Abimelech, and put them to the hold, and set the hold on fire upon them, so that all the men of the tower of Shechem died also, about 1,000 men and women. Let's see, did we go down to 49? Okay, yeah. I labeled this as be careful who you follow. Abimelech had, he gone to the forts of everything. He got a branch and took it to the tower, and he set it on fire. And you notice how in verse 49 it said, all the people likewise. And as we commonly like to go point out, all means all. No exceptions. No one spoke up and asked, should we really be doing this? Peer pressure is real at any age. You can say you would never bend, but it's easy to say that when your life isn't in jeopardy. I imagine if anybody here had spoken up and said, hey, should we really be doing this? They would have been viewed as a traitor and probably stabbed. It's a lot easier in situations like this. It's a lot easier, like when we use our discernment to see what's coming, and we get out of Dodge when the getting's good. There are times where the further along you go and you be blind to the situation that you get in, it's like, oh great, now it's going to be a real problem to get out of this whatever mess I'm in. Whereas if I'd have just seen what was coming, I could have like gotten out of there before it was a real problem. That was, one of the things that if you take a concealed carry class, one of the things they will tell you is to be aware of the surroundings, to be alert, because you need to be, you can't just be, blindly walk through and then all of a sudden, realize I just walked through an armed robbery in progress and not pay attention. And now you got to force to defend yourself, where if you'd have used some discernment and be aware of your surroundings, you're like, oh, this doesn't look right. So whatever's going on here, I don't want to be here. The same thing with a child of God. There are going to be situations where you can look and say, I can see where this is going. I can see how this situation is going to turn out. And you know what? I'm going to leave right now so that I don't have to be there when things get really bad. It's always best to, if there's going to be a problem that doesn't involve you, to be gone when it all happens. Verses 50 to 52. Then went Abimelech to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and took it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and thither fled all the men and women and all they of the city, and shut it to them, and gat them up to the top of the tower. And Abimelech went unto the tower and fought against it, and went hard unto the door of the tower to burn it with fire. I labeled this as no new tricks. Burning a tower worked for Abimelech before, so hey, why change a winning strategy? It worked before, it should work again. But you know who else who has no new tricks? The devil. 2 Corinthians 2:11 talks about, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. The devil has no new tricks. He has no new things. But the thing is, what he does have, though, is thousands of years of observing humanity. And he knows what tactics work. And, he may be able to, he knows, okay, I know that, okay, Pastor Tuttle, I'm not going to be able to tempt him with alcohol. But I can tempt him with, we'll have somebody come into church and sow division and split off and leave and bring off people. And that will get him angry and bitter and mad. The devil knows every one of us, and he knows, what our weakness is, and he knows what tactics to use against us. Let's see here. And there are many times, we want to yield to the temptation. Sometimes, our worldly nature, always wants, whatever is wrong. I think that was last week's Sunday school, how the worldly nature knows no restraint. It all, you said you could be up to your eyeballs in sin, and something else comes along that entices the flesh, and you'll jump feet first into it, man. That's just, so we shouldn't be, so we should be able to, again, one of those times, we should be able to know our own, our own self-examination to say, I've got a weakness against maybe bitterness or anger. And it's like, okay, if that's the case, then I need to be prepared so that, maybe I need to have these verses on hand. Maybe I need to know, keep aware of my situation. If I'm going to be in some place that's going to, cause me to get angry, maybe I shouldn't be there. Or maybe I should, I've told several people, there are several discussions or topics that I cannot talk very much about because, when you start talking about them, the amount of the indignation that I have with them, it's like I cannot talk about it very much because otherwise, there are things this world does that just will make any normal person mad. And I don't want to talk about them too much because do you really want to spend your whole life mad? So we need to be, we just need to be aware of what the tricks the devil is going to use. And they said, he's not going to pull some new trick on us. It's always, we know what they are. The Bible says what they are. So next, verses 53 and 54. Back down where I was at. And a certain woman cast a piece of millstone upon Abimelech's head, and and all to break his skull. 50 years. And then he called hastily unto the young man his armor-bearer, and said unto him, Draw thy sword, and slay me, that the men say not of me, A woman slew him. And his young man thrust him through, and he died. This is the point where I labeled it as coincidence? I think not. The world is willingly blind to the actions of God. They chalk things up to luck. They say, I was lucky today. I dodged the deer on the road, and then I got to work, and I got in just in time. I managed to make it in time, so I got lucky there. I got lucky, and I got the employee bonus today. Coming home, let's see, what would be something else lucky? Oh, I got my gas, the one gas station that hadn't jumped $1. I've been really lucky today. The world is willingly blind to the actions of God. Eventually, though, when enough lucky things happen in a row, you have to start wondering, is this really happenstance, or is somebody orchestrating events? William has mentioned, it's been a while, but he's mentioned that, the Lord orders the day. He orchestrates the day. He decides, and, if anything happens to you in a day, this is no surprise to God. God said, okay, today at 3:55 at this road, somebody's going to cut Bob off. And now Bob's got the choice, a little test for Bob. Is he going to get mad? Or is he going to praise God because he didn't get in an accident? There is no coincidences in this world. The thing is, though, with the world, answering this question, leads to truths that the world doesn't want to know, doesn't want an answer. They want to be willingly blind to the actions of God, because if there is, if somebody says, that isn't luck, that's somebody orchestrating it. And if that means there's somebody orchestrating it, that means there's a supreme being, and that means, do I have to answer to this being? That leads down a path that many in the world do not want to, don't want an answer to. They don't want to acknowledge that there's somebody that directs their life. They're in charge of their life and no one else. I believe Pastor Sewell's had that problem. Would encounter people like that said, you can't put me in jail. People that when he was former pastor, was an Ohio State trooper, and there were times that people would tell him, you can't put me in jail. And there were times when he got to the jail, he asked the sheriff, whoever, says, I want to do this. And he would be the one who would slam the bar shut on them and laugh in their face. So believe me, there will be people in our life that will be able to tell you what to do. Verse 55. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, they departed every man unto his place. I labeled this as force of personality. Let's see. 5 minutes here. I have to summarize the verses. In Acts, when some of the apostles were taken before the Pharisees and such like that, they were the Pharisees like, why are you doing this? I told you not to. And they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And one of the Pharisees, or one of the leaders, said, put these men out. And he said unto them that, if these men, he listed off several people that had tried rebellions, and he said, if what they're doing is of man, it's going to fail. But if it's of God, less happily be found to even fight against God. The point is with this is that a person's devices and plans generally only seem to last their lifetime. This is what happens when you follow a person instead of God. A person is temporary. God is eternal. Psalms 49 talks about that. It says, talks about people that they think they'll be remembered forever. It talks of Psalms 49:11. It says, their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands by after their own names. This will be the Tuttle estate. you know, and
Tower.
yeah, and this will be this will be known as the area of Tuttle, you know. But you know, thing is, it generally only lasts their lifetime. You know, how many of you have ever heard of a man named Arthur Vandenberg? Anybody? Arthur Vandenberg. Anybody? Anybody? Nobody? Come on, I'm disappointed in all of you. He was a very powerful U.S. senator from 1928 to 1951. I had to look him up. I just you know, looked out powerful political figures, and he was one of them that popped up. But how many revere his accomplishments today? How many try to emulate him? Does any, you guys even know who he was? No. You know, so there might have been a few people that remembered him for a few years after he passed away, but you know, here we are 70 years later, nobody even knows who he is anymore. The same thing, you know, people that, you know, if you follow a person, when they go away, everything, you know, if you base your life, your principles on that person, when they pass away, what are you going to do? You're now your rule, your guide is now gone. That is why, you know, we should follow God. You know, it says God is eternal. Man is temporal. God is eternal. God never changes. So what God says and the guide and the standard that God has set will never change. So we know, and because God's never going to die, he's never going to go away. So we'll always have the same standard, the same rule to follow. And then finish up with verses 56 and 57. Thus God rendered the wickedness of Abimelech, which he did unto his father, in slaying his 70 brethren. And all the men of Shechem died, and all the evil of the men of Shechem did God render upon their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham the son of Jerubbabel. I labeled this as God rendered, because in the end, no one gets away with anything. God sees all and he knows all. They may not be punished in the time frame and manner that we would want, but God has a time and place for all of it. And this isn't just for the bad either. You know, the things that we do for the Lord, and no one seems to notice. You know, no one seems to notice that, you know, no one seems to know that I clean the windows and I vacuum the carpets in the church. No one, you know, I've done it for 20 years and no one has even told me thank you. The Lord notices. The Lord sees it. And he won't forget about it either. The reward may not be in the time frame or manner that we want, but there will be a reward for it. So the Lord sees all, and what does it say? You know, even if you have a cup of cold water in his name, it will not go unrewarded. So even the smallest of service to the Lord will be rewarded. Like I said, it may not be in the time frame and manner you want. You know, you're not going to handle a cold cup of water, then the next day a check for $1 million drop in your mailbox. Yeah, unless it's like Elon Musk and he's starving or, you know, dying of dry somewhere. No. Yeah, that's just, you know, we're always thinking that, oh, the reward's always going to be physical. It's going to be cash in hand. You know, God doesn't work that. Sometimes he does, but God doesn't always work, you know, with the physical. There are many times, you know, God works in the spiritual. He gives, you know, he may, the lessons you learn, who knows? The time meditating as you're vacuuming the carpets, God may show you something, you know, bring a Bible verse to your memory. How many of us have read the same Bible verse 20 times, and the 21st time, it's like, whoa, this is a revelation. You know, sometimes, you know, God may give you that. Many times, it's the blessing, the reward is spiritual. So, but God renders, you know, the good and the bad. And we are a minute over, so let's finish up. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day, Lord. We thank you for your word, Lord, that you've given us. I pray that you be with the upcoming services, Lord, that you would give Pastor your power as he speaks to us.